Former President Trump and his lawyers want the U.S. Supreme Court of the United States to read the Washington Post, specifically this December 23rd article, which features an interview with January 6th Committee Chairman Benny Thompson, a Democrat, who said the panel is looking into ordering the Justice Department to open a criminal probe into the former president. Joining us now, CNN congressional correspondent Ryan Nobles. Ryan, why do Trump's lawyers want the U.S. Supreme Court to read this article so badly?
Well, it's based on the premise that the former president and many of his allies have made trying to undercut the credibility of the January 6th Select Committee. They argue that the committee does not have at its specific goal a legislative purpose, meaning that the reason that this committee exists is to draft legislation that would ultimately lead to laws, but instead, in their mind, it's nothing more than an attempt to try and catch either the former president or his allies in some sort of criminal conspiracy that would ultimately lead to criminal charges. Now, this is something the committee has soundly rejected. They've said that, indeed, their main goal is a legislative purpose, and at the end of all of this, they hope to tell a story as to what happened on January 6th and then offer up some tangible legislative fixes to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Still, the Trump lawyers believe that this is an opportunity for the courts to prevent the National Archives from handing over a whole tranche of documents under the banner of executive privilege. At this point, Jake, it's not clear whether or not the Supreme Court will even take this case up, let alone settle this dispute.
And Ryan, the Justice Department responded to Trump's request?
Yeah, that's right. The Justice Department argues that they're siding, of course, with the Biden administration on this. And remember, it is the White House and the current occupant of the White House that gets to determine where executive privilege lies. And in this case, they believe that the protection of the former president and his interests are outweighed by the interests of the public, the general public and the American people, to get to the bottom of what exactly happened on January 6th, and that the collection of this information and the distilling of it is necessary by the January 6th Select Committee. That's their argument. It's going to be, of course, up to the courts to decide which side is correct, if, of course, Jake, the Supreme Court even decides whether or not they're going to deal with this.
Ryan Nobles, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Let's discuss this with our august panel. Simon Kent, let me start with you. Trump and his lawyers are arguing that this whole case about submitting White House records poses this unique conflict between a sitting president and a former president. And, you know, he has a point. Of course, that doesn't necessarily excuse him from consequences if he broke the law, right?
Right, that's certainly correct. And I think what's important to remember, too, is that previous courts, and the reason why this issue could make it is at the Supreme Court in the first place, is that previous federal courts at a district level, the circuit level, have agreed with President Biden's position that the public and, you know, by virtue of the committee, has a right to these records. Now, President Trump is certainly not the only person being targeted by this committee that have looked to the courts to try to throw sand in the gears, to try to slow down the process. Certainly he is the most prominent one, but you've seen so many others in his orbit. For example, one of his spokesmen go to the court to try to stop the committee from accessing his bank records. There are a number of people who are being targeted by the January 6th committee, who are looking to the courts to try to impede the work of this committee. Now, whether they'll be successful is another question, but obviously we all know, we've talked about it several times before, about how this January 6th committee is probably working on borrowed time. So obviously time is of the essence here.
Joining me now to discuss is former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman. Harry, great to see you. How important is it for the Select Committee to get an answer either way pretty soon?
Well, what they really want is the right answer. So there's not going to be that. What they've requested is that the court consider the request on the papers on their conference on January 14th. The hope here is the court will just say the lower courts were right. We don't need to weigh in. And at that point, they're good to go as of, say, January 30th. It's all over for Trump, and the administrator just turns over the records. Even if the court takes the case, there's still barely enough time for them to hear it and decide it by June. And then within a very quick scramble, they could still use the records if they do receive them. And there are two issues in the case. It's not just what the harm could be, but it's this whole issue of, does Biden make the call when he has clearly said so here? And that would be the issue that the court would be deciding. But when here matters almost as much as what, and the first focus is, getting them not to take the case, saying it's not worth their time, it's fairly settled, and doing it by, say, 4 weeks from now.
Yeah. Let's talk about more broadly the January 6th House Select Committee investigation. There's this really interesting op-ed in the Los Angeles Times titled, "Do Trump's January 6th sins of omission and commission make him criminally liable?" And let me just read people part of this. Quote, "Even if Trump anticipated merely a peaceful rally at the Capitol on January 6th, his role in setting a deadly insurgency in motion arguably means he could not legally decline to intervene as if he were just an accidental bystander." It goes on to say Trump's criminal liability isn't only dependent on the fact that inaction can sometimes break the law, he's vulnerable to an even more potential charge, potent charge, rather, aiding and abetting criminal behavior. Now, for the president's part, he said earlier this month on Fox, "I wasn't involved in that, and if you look at my words and what I said on the speech, they were extremely calming, actually." Not exactly correct, but that's what the president says. I find this question of aiding and abetting fascinating. What do you think?
Yeah, let me start here. Aiding and abetting feels to a lot of us like kind of criminal liability light. It's not.
It's
the
not.
federal law is really clear. You aid and abet, that's the same as a principal. So that's for starters. Then how do you aid and abet? You do it by encouraging with the right mental attitude. If in other words, when he's there, he's trying to rev them up. And then thereafter, right? We know he goes over 3 hours when all his closest associates are screaming at Mark Meadows because nobody can get to Trump, make him stop this, and he does nothing. That, under the law, the so-called inaction really is action. And it is action, logically, too. The people are there. They're saying Trump sent us. They're buoyed by being let loose and nobody stopping them. And that's the real impact of what he was doing. Under the law, the criminal charge is solid. Now, that big saber has been rattled by the committee, starting with Cheney. And it means that they would be on solid ground in making a referral. What would happen thereafter at the Department of Justice? That would be a huge headache for Merrick Garland.
Let's talk about what would happen there, because and I think it's important to note, you don't need a criminal referral to DOJ from this committee for DOJ to move forward. They can do it without a referral from the committee. But if there was a criminal referral of the former president to the committee, given that DOJ so far has not prosecuted any political figures for the insurrection, what does that indicate to you regarding whether Attorney General Garland would charge Trump?
Yeah, so your point is really well taken, Poppy, because when the department knows it's getting in, before the criminal referral, arguably the House was the victim, and that made their referral more weighty. Here, it wouldn't carry any extra weight on paper, because they'd be saying, we have this information, we're investigating, thank you very much. But it would carry extra weight, I think, sort of politically and in the whole dynamic. And I just want to say, the New Year's a focusing event for all of us, for the committee who wants to hold public hearings on 5 separate topics and issue an interim report and litigate all these things and maybe go after their colleagues. They are now having to be in an all-out sprint, and adding to it the possibility of a criminal referral for the former president. There's not going to be a lot of sleeping by their very big and competent staff over the next few months.
All right, Harry Litman, thank you so much. Wishing you a good, healthy New Year.
Yes. Happy New Year.